Hello, my friends. It's John Peterson from the Arlington Institute, and we're here to talk about transition talks. We've got a marvelous speaker that's coming up here next month in May. John Bloom is going to be with us, coming out from San Francisco. Hi, John. How are you, sir?
I'm fine and looking forward to being there and looking forward to engaging in some pretty provocative, I hope, conversations.
Well, John, to my way of thinking, you're Mr. Rudolf Steiner. I mean, you are the guy who, probably one of the guys at least, that knows as much about Rudolf Steiner as anybody else. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know that it's possible to know everything about someone who was so prodigious in activities through his life. I certainly am as familiar as I can be with a lot of it, and have been engaged with it in deep practice. So yeah.
Well, in addition to that, you run the American organization for Steiner, right?
That is true. I'm the general secretary for the Anthroposophical Society, and so 4,000 members, all of whom have a deep interest in Rudolf Steiner's work, but also in the practical activities that have emerged from all of that work over the last 100 years or so.
Well, Steiner, for our viewers who may not be familiar, was an extraordinary guy who when was he alive, John?
1861 to 1925. So
Right.
certainly.
And you would characterize him as a mystic and a artist, all kinds of things. I mean, how would you?
Yeah, I think I would characterize him primarily as a philosopher, because much of the work, and certainly anthroposophy itself, which is the wisdom of the human being, is about how we know things. And that's really the work of a philosopher, although he was also an engineer and scientist. So much of his approach was a scientific approach of saying what is the hypothesis? What's the experiment? What are we trying to understand? Is it working or not? Do we need to change the hypothesis? So it was really a process of knowing. Yeah.
Well, but he also was applied. He was an applied scientist, if you will, because
Sure,
he
absolutely.
invented amazing things.
Biodynamics. Yeah, right. Yeah, I know. And Waldorf education also came, anthroposophical medicine, many practices, a form of movement called eurythmy. And most of that came later in his life, when people saw a tremendous need for change, particularly after World War I, which ended in 1718. And the world was really falling apart and something new needed to come. So farmers asked him, what do you have to say about agriculture? 1922, the economics lectures. So it was quite an active time of change. Yeah.
But he extracted a lot of his knowledge from this ability to kind of see how things worked. He had this mystical or psychic kind of capability, medium perhaps, to be able to just see the actual workings of biology and more to the point of our talk coming up next week or next month is that he could then start to translate those kind of understandings into the bigger kind of a realm of how how human society works and such.
Sure. Yeah. It all really started from his understanding of the human being, internally, and the sort of the three aspects of the human being, which is thinking, feeling, and willing. And that's like shorthand for a whole lot of of understanding. But then came to also understand, particularly after the disaster of World War I, of how we organize ourselves socially and politically and economically, and even culturally, that imagination also could find a place in a way that we could structure society that recognized the dignity of the human being and wasn't about a lot of power and politics and raw, search for raw
Well,
materials. And yeah.
it was a wonderfully creative and profound and deep kind of knowing and these proposals that he made, because I've not really, frankly, read anything else that kind of took on the whole issue of how do you read, how do you redesign society? How do and that's essentially what you're going to talk about, right?
Exactly. And I have not found much pushback on a shared recognition of a need for a change in consciousness, right? Some consciousness shift has to happen, or we're stuck in our same insane patterns. Where I have found pushback is what is the methodology that we're going to come to that new stage of consciousness, and that was really the challenge that even Steiner ran into in his own time, bringing these ideas. He really felt, well, we need a new kind of education that changes how people think creatively and imaginatively, such that we might be able to shift that kind of consciousness. So absolutely, yeah, and
Yeah,
practical
but it
tools.
was more than that. It was this comprehensive, integrated approach that took on government, it took on creativity and arts, it took on the economic sector. I mean, this is a big idea that has extraordinary direct kind of implications to where we're going, because we're going into a period of time where a lot of the existing infrastructure and the institutions that we're familiar with are going to inevitably collapse, I believe.
Yeah.
And so you start to say, so then what? And this is one of the most interesting kind of answers to that kind of a question.
Sure. Well, I don't know how much time we have, and but if one looks at those sectors of how do we rethink culture and how we are in it, and how do we rethink our realm of not just the politics, but our creation, how we create agreements on an interpersonal level all the way up to a society level, so through community, through our organizations, in perspective of true equality. And so we're wrestling with the question of equity. That's a huge question. So things are already kind of up in a way. The question is, toward what end, right? What does that look like, so that if we find ways of, of finding better equity in voting rights, whatever that issue is, that's great. But then what happens then? So that what, right? And that's the fascinating part, because ultimately it is how we actually have collectively power with each other, and actually to free up the individual and each person to kind of step into the world for their own mission and their own destiny. And
Well, in the
that's a
end,
dynamic tension between those two, right?
right. But in the end, the value of all of this is in practicality and what you can do about it. And your talk is not a talk about just highfalutin theoretical possibilities. This is about applied things, about saying how would a new government work, or how would a new economy work, and so on. And so it's very useful and very interesting and provocative in this time where we're looking for new answers.
Sure. I mean, some key pieces are touch on behavioral change. And that is always the place where it gets, I would say, a little bit delicate, and saying, I think that's a great idea. You mean I have to change? Oops, right. So what are the tools that we need to actually support each other in guiding that change? And whether it is from how we do economics, how prices get set, what do our food systems look like, and how do we create a food system actually that meets everybody's needs, not just the eaters and not just the distributors or producers, and how do we really rethink our whole systems? And each one of those are kind of system-wide questions, and where do they come from in us?
Well, if we're going to redesign our system that we live in, then we're going to have to think about these kinds of things. And your talk here in May is going to be a very provocative and useful approach to kind of putting on the table options that most people have not thought about, frankly. And you may not buy it all, but it'll start you thinking. It's yeah, it certainly started me thinking about all of this.
Sure.
I found it very provocative.
Yeah. Well, if it raises questions and creates, I would say, reflective loops in our day-to-day practices that say, oh, so here are my values, and does what I'm doing actually follow those values, or am I just, and that does, for me, that's the foundation for change.
Yeah.
Without the question, you don't get the change. So,
Well, this is going to be fun. I mean, we'll put underneath here what the date is and the time, and it's here in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, just 100 miles from Washington and Baltimore, and our marvelous little resort town in the mountains. And we hope that you'll come and be with us, those of you who are watching this. And if you can't come and be with us, it's going to be live streamed. And so it doesn't make any difference where you are or how you're dressed or anything else. You can sit back and watch this for 2 weeks. So you can get a complete information at transitiontalks.org. But we hope that you'll join us. It's going to be a delightful, provocative time. And we always have a good time here in Berkeley Springs, where we have dinner afterwards, and we're in a room that's got a bar on the side of it, and we open the bar up in the middle of for questions and answers, and so it ends up being a very nice social event. And so, John, we're looking forward to having you with us, and we're looking forward to a very provocative and interesting time.
I look forward to the depths that can unfold out of that process as well.